The Expanse, nothing to do with the Sci-Fi Channel series, of course, was a turning point for the series, a clear dividing line between one era of the show and another. After this time, the show largely embraced overall story arcs, longer-form narratives with much higher stakes. The occasional episode of the week would show up, certainly, but overall The Expanse is a soft reboot of the series. And let's be clear, it was needed. The show's direction had been absolutely pathetic. Characterization that frequently bumped up against cartoonish. Dubious storylines. Highly questionable behavior treated as the only reasonable course of action. Just a general attitude that seems like they hated the very show they were working on. Archer was supposed to be an explorer, the pioneer of Starfleet who paves the way for Kirk, Picard, and Janeway to go out and explore the galaxy. But no, that's not what we got. We got a rube half the time, facing the unknown with the expression of someone who spots a nun tearing off her habit to reveal she's wearing a Wonder Woman costume underneath, encountering the frontier with semi-bemused confusion. The rest of the time, he was even worse than that, so full of moral certitude and with just enough at his command to be a danger to himself and those around him. He was the frickin' Kaiser Soze of outer space, flaming wreckage in his wake. And so too would be his effect on the franchise. You just have to look at the ratings graph to see what was happening with Enterprise and to note where this soft reboot came in. Season 1 had a massive downward plunge, even factoring in that the two-part opening was going to have higher views. In Season 2, the rating stunt of A Night in Sickbay blew up in their faces, providing a momentary spike that was followed by a mass exit. The only thing that stops it from being a sickening drop for the rest of Season 2 was the Borg episode Regeneration, this episode, and to a small degree the doubleheader celebrating the 50th episode of the series. Contrast this with Season 3, which had much more consistent viewing ratings throughout, and impressively closed the season at nearly the same figures as it started with. Not to mention that Season 3 was the only one where viewing figures for the first episode actually had gone up from the previous season. And Season 4 had practically no drop to it at all if you look at the overall trend line. When you look at the data, it's clear to see that Seasons 1 and 2 shed viewers consistently. Even people who had stayed through Voyager were unwilling to stay for what Enterprise was offering. Seasons 3 and 4 showed that the audience by and large was willing to stick with the show. And while one could argue that the raw data does not speak to motivations, this could just have been all that remained of a loyal Star Trek audience, after all, that would stick with the franchise through anything. But given the radical transformation the show underwent, I think it's safe to say that it was the new direction of the show that kept its audience rather than simply inertia. Let's start looking at the episode. We can get into the other stuff later. It opens with the scrappy duo of Death Stars appearing in the skies over Earth and blasting Florida, cutting a swath south to eventually reach Venezuela before the craft runs out of juice and just falls from the sky. It's a powerful, effective teaser. I'll certainly give them that. And in keeping with our theme of what makes a good teaser, it's short, not even 45 seconds long. But things are less reassuring when we get back from the titles and find ourselves amongst Klingons. You might remember Bounty. Or if you're very fortunate, you've purged your mind of everything about Bounty. So just in case you're in that enviable position, Archer is a wanted man by the Klingons. As I said, Archer's the Kaiser Soze of outer space, flaming wreckage in his wake, and like that, he's gone. To make up for this disaster, the High Council is sending Duras to go deal with Archer once and for all, to provide the action elements of the episode, because I'm afraid the alien threat at the beginning is finished, so it's instant drama. Just add Klingons. Over on Enterprise, Archer calls a meeting of the senior staff to tell them about the attack on Earth. Initial estimates of the death toll are already 1 million people, but eventually it's going to hit 7 million. Enterprise is being recalled to Earth. They know very little. The pod contained only a single dead pilot of an unidentified species and no hints from the wreckage on who was responsible. You can't discuss this episode without bringing up the September 11th attacks. Some shows, such as 24, benefited, not that anyone wanted to benefit from a tragedy, obviously, from the timing of these attacks, while others, such as Enterprise, did not. Enterprise already suffered from feeling like a relic of the previous decade, having avoided any real advances in its storytelling. Now add in the fact that the franchise in general is about peaceful coexistence, that non-intervention is the height of enlightenment, and that ideals always trump pragmatism, and has served as a stark contrast to the general mood of the American people in the wake of the attack. Now, that is not to say that this proves those ideas are wrong. Those ideas were just as much valid or invalid before this happened as afterwards. They could be advanced and debated on their own merits. Nor is there anything wrong with offering a reprieve from the grimness of reality, or to offer an alternative perspective to people who weren't necessarily in keeping with that sentiment. None of this is about whether or not Enterprise was right or wrong. All it's about is that if you take this element of it and combine it with the point earlier about storytelling remaining trapped in the 90s, what you wind up is an overall sense that the program is out of step with the 21st century, much like Season 1 TNG felt out of step with the late 80s when it was broadcast. Thus, the episode here is deliberately trying to create a parallel situation with its own unforeseen attack on an unsuspecting place, including having an ever higher estimate of casualties and a visit to the site of the devastation, paralleling footage of volunteers at Ground Zero. It's all part of an effort to show that Enterprise is moving closer to reality, not just by including tragedy, but effectively saying that they were no longer going to be trapped in the past, but developing their show to have the sophistication that a 21st century drama needs. To further complicate all of this is the fact that the show already has a subplot nobody wanted. That, of course, is the temporal Cold War, which would not even qualify as being a background simmer so much as the occasional eruption of marsh gas. As we discussed before, they didn't know what they were going to do with this thing, so it's been a real make-it-up-as-they-go-along element to the show. But naturally, this would be something the audience would first think of, that this attack is somehow related to this story tumor. So to assure the audiences that things are going in a different direction, the Sullivans show up and nab Archer, but just so he can be brought to the future guy so he can explain that he had nothing to do with it. After all, wouldn't be much of a Cold War if they launched an all-out attack, would it? Future Guy explains that it was done by the Zindy because someone told them that in 400 years humanity will destroy their world, so they plan to destroy us first. The attack was a weapons test, which naturally prompts the question of why would the Zindy tip their hand by testing the weapon on Earth itself? However, to prove that I am not biased against Enterprise, I will come to the defense of this plot point. The Zindy know nothing about Earth and are aware that Earth knows nothing about them. Therefore, by doing this with their weapon, which is referred to a probe actually, they can first gather intel about Earth and humanity, then launch a weapons test on the intended target itself, and finally self-destruct, leaving them with no way of knowing who launched the attack. Indeed, part of the obstruction that Archer will be facing is the fact that he is saying that the Zindy launched the attack and no one else has heard of them. After all, he only found out about it from a time traveler, and you can't really fault the Zindy for not figuring that a time traveler would be working against them. You might argue that it still was a mistake. They should have tested it somewhere else and just sent a probe to make humans curious. But given the factions that are involved, it's plausible to think that this was the result of a consensus, something the more reckless and aggressive might have pushed for until the more cautious finally relented. After all, sometimes the cooler head is forced to acquiesce to the demands of the aggressively irrational.
I'm sure Starfleet and the High Command will find a far more logical explanation of who attacked Earth.
He may be telling the truth. If he is, I need your support. Not your damn skepticism.
I rest my case. Archer's typical dickery is interrupted by an attack by the Klingons, but with them being this close to Earth, help quickly arrives to drive them off, so we can get back to the real plot. Soval is also skeptical and points out that the coordinates Archer has for the Zindy are within the Delphic Expanse, a region of space that is generally really effed up.
You'd be more than foolish to pursue this course of action.
So we found the right man for the job. But Archer has proof, actually, which is good because usually he just insists he's right because he's a dumbass. He uses quantum dating. We went over this previously, so there's no need to get into it again about why it doesn't make any sense. But fortunately, not making sense is exactly what Archer is normally banking on. So he reveals that one of the necessary components in the probe has a negative age, meaning that it has to have traveled from the future, or it's lied about its age to get into an antimatter bar. In response to this, the Vulcans slip a psychiatrist on board to try to figure out if Archer is crazy, something I think we can all agree has been a long time coming. But Starfleet has decided to go ahead with the plan, working to upgrade Enterprise and, at Archer's request, bringing military person on board. You can clearly see the fingerprints of Braga all over this. There are many things that he has always wanted to do that he has always been held back from doing. Year of Hell was supposed to be an entire season-long event instead of just a two-parter. But even though both he and Berman were executive producers together, it was always obvious who was the boss and who had to do what he was told. But when the orders came down from above that the show was a disaster needing a radical change, that obviously gave Braga the opportunity to finally push some of his ideas through. Basically with him, you could tell when he was operating in his element and when he was just doing his job. The former were triumphs, and the latter was just face-palming. This whole Zindy thing is putting him right into his comfort zone, and you're already seeing signs of it. Tucker, for instance, whose sister was killed in the attack, is struggling with his grief, not just the fact that she's dead, but the fact that she is one of 7 million. He feels guilty that when so many others are hurting, he's focused on his own pain, about just one person. It's a confused and complicated emotional situation that he has found himself in. And the story finally allows Trenier to have material to work with to show what he is capable of. There's also the complication of T'Pol, of course not a member of Starfleet, but of the people who disapprove of this mission, and who consequently are recalling her to Vulcan.
High Command was quite specific. You're to return to Vulcan.
I believe that should be my decision.
Huh? I don't think it works that way. I think you have to go where you're told unless you quit. So she'll be going back to Vulcan by way of Enterprise. Vulcan is basically on the way to the Delphic Expanse. And of course, Starfleet is all about reducing your carbon footprint by carpooling. They get attacked by Klingons along the way to allow Enterprise to show that its upgrades have made it more powerful since they easily mop the floor with one bird of prey using their enhanced armor and photon torpedoes. And of course, their cute cuddly dog. Klingons have no chance against that. T'Pol finally decides that she is going to resign and join the crew anyway, and while Archer tries to talk her out of it, when it's clear that she really wants to do this, and it would be a huge help to have her scientific expertise in a place where the laws of physics don't always operate properly, Archer agrees, and that means that next season she'll get to wear actual clothes. Oh, that'll be a bit of a novelty after 2 seasons of the Fap at Me line of uniforms she had to wear. There's a very thick cloud surrounding the Delphic Expanse, and on the way we get one last action scene when the Klingons show up to attack again. This time with 3 ships because, there's nothing more honorable than ganging up on somebody. But it took them so long that Enterprise is nearly through, and the Expanse is so awful that even Klingons are afraid to go in there. So the other 2 ships break off the attack. So it's a one-on-one fight. And being the season finale, you can obviously guess who wins. So with that, it's off to a season-long story arc. The post-episode follow-up. Annoying character goes to the Klingons. Thanks for getting in the way there, jerks. Final score for The Expanse is 7 out of 10. While it is an important episode to the series, the episode doesn't completely deliver on everything needed to make it a successful relaunch, as if they just don't trust the audience to come back unless they have some explosions in the finale. If anything, these scenes undermine the tragedy of the teaser, seconds of violence leading to a great personal tragedy, and then followed by multiple, much longer scenes of violence as the same old, same old. Plus, they eat up screen time that could have been devoted to Hoshi and Mayweather, who never get a chance to show their feelings on either the attack or the mission. It doesn't ruin it or anything, but it does show a weakness in the storytelling.
every crewman on board had been anatomically inverted, their bodies splayed open, and they were still alive.